The Edmonton Oilers just might have a Darnell Nurse problem.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Tuesday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everybody who makes Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, part Locked On Podcast Network. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Now that the playoffs are over, the sports have stopped sporting like we want them to, but this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right, there's something for everyone every day all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. So today's episode, this is going to be a Darnell Nurse deep dive. This is going to be an in-depth evaluation of Darnell Nurse as a player. We're going to analyze the context of his career in relation to where he was drafted, the type of team he was coming into, the trajectory of his development, and when he took certain roles. We're going to talk about his strengths, what his strengths are supposed to be because of his physical traits. And then we're going to wrap up with some final thoughts about Nurse's role with the team going forward and what he represents about the team going forward. So starting out in the abstract, it's really important to start with the context. I always, whenever I'm doing a player evaluation, I start with the foundational contextual principles of an evaluation. First and foremost, where and who were they drafted by? So if we go to the record, Darnell Nurse was taken 7th overall in 2013 when Craig McTavish was the general manager. Of the 7th overall picks in the history of the entry draft, 25th most games played as the 7th overall pick, 640 regular season games, not including playoffs. You got to remember what the Oilers were looking like in 2012, 2013. That team's first 6 defensemen were Jeff Petrie, Justin Schultz, Nick Schultz, Ladislav Schmidt, Ryan Whitney, and Corey Potter. The Oilers right now have a number one defenseman in Evan Bouchard. The Oilers' defining struggle of the 2010s, especially post McDavid, was the inability to round out their defense, to find the right mix of 6 defensemen, and to figure out that supplemental cast, that bottom 6 forward group, the goalie. And for much of the 2010s, that Oilers defense was number 3s, number 2s, number 2s shoehorned into number 1s, number 3s shoehorned into number 2s. And it always created this environment where it was very difficult for defensemen to be successful because they were being asked to do things they weren't particularly good at. And understanding the context of Nurse's career, it matters a lot because it leads you to getting to where the Oilers are at in the present day. You have to understand that when guys get picked in the first round, they are going to get a lot of chances. When they play a position of need, and this is why it's not a good thing to draft for need, a team is going to give them chances. You think about the defense of the 2010s and you think of guys I just mentioned, Schultz, Petrie. You obviously think of Oscar Klefbom. You obviously think of Adam Larson. But none of those guys profiled as a true number one defenseman. The Oilers took Darnell Nurse 7th overall 11 years ago with the mindset of this is going to be our number one defenseman. He's going to play power play. He's going to kill penalties. He's big. He can skate. The toolbox, I get it. I 100% understand the amateur evaluation, where the Oilers were coming from. They were drafting for need. Nurse did not come to the NHL for 2 years after he was drafted. His first full season at the NHL level was 2015, 2016, and he immediately gets the 4th most minutes of any defenseman on the team, behind Oscar Klefbom, Andre Sekera, Jordan Osterley, and then Nurse. The year after that, Adam Larson and Chris Russell play more minutes than Nurse, including Klefbom, Sekera, and Osterley. Nurse takes a big step back. Then 2017, 2018, second most minutes. And then the first time he leads the Oilers in average time on ice is that 56-game season. That 56-game season, the Canada-only division year where they were swept by the Winnipeg Jets in the first round, that was a perfect storm of situational factors that led to Nurse being able to command the contract he did and putting together a outlier season. When you go and look under the hood, it's very easy to see where that jump in production and where that perceived future value was coming from. And the Oilers are now in a position where, because they did not plan out their roster in advance, they had to make decisions. And it's very difficult to not put these decisions in their present context. But the Oilers had no way of knowing that Bouchard was going to blossom the way he did, because if they did, they would not have given Nurse that contract. There was no way for them to know that they were going to be able to get Matthias Ekholm and make it work so well between him and Evan Bouchard. They didn't know that. Part of the reason they gave Nurse the contract that they did. They were in a position where, because they had been so starved for quality defensemen, they felt the obligation to overpay for somebody coming off of a career year in an outlier environment. And you got to remember, I don't know how many people can vividly remember watching games from that 2021 56-game season that kind of felt like a fever dream. That Canadian-only division was a bandbox. It's kind of like the Dutch league in soccer, where if you're having a bad season in a bigger league, you go there, you score 30 goals, and then you get a nice transfer to a first-tier team in England, and then you score 5 goals, and that team is pissed they bought the dip on you. That's kind of what happened here with the Oilers, where they put up the crazy counting stats. Everybody on that team put up really good numbers, and Nurse did it in a walk year of his contract, where it would have been difficult for the Oilers to walk away from him because they needed a defenseman. And because of that, they were forced into a corner. And this is what I talked about on yesterday's show in regards to Evander Kane. Eventually, the bill comes due for mistakes. It's not just a means of making sure one team doesn't hoard all the talent. It's also a means of auditing general manager performance and seeing how shrewd they are and managing the salary cap. Because there's a real argument that salary cap management is just as important, if not more important, than roster construction, because when the salary cap is so low in comparison to the other sports, a contract like Nurse's, that's 10%, it's 9.5, but we'll round up 10% of the overall cap. You need that player to be a slam dunk impact player. And instead, Nurse unquestionably has lost standing in the pecking order. And now the Oilers are at a point where they're in the bargaining stages of regret of that contract. And they can't move him for at least 2 more years, but we'll get there. That's more of a third segment of today's show topic of where they go from here and talking about the bigger picture. But the last thought I want to leave you with before we move on to talking about what his skill set is supposed to correlate to. The Oilers tried to do this the right way. And it would be a very difficult marketing pitch or sell, if you will, to the fan base that coming off a career year, we're going to let this guy walk because we don't believe it's real. We think this is an outlier, because the average hockey fan is not going to take the time to go investigate the production. They're not going to look at, oh, he's a career 5% shooter, but he shot 10% this season. They're not going to look at Connor McDavid averaging 2 points per game almost in that 56-game season. They are going to look at it as, this was our best defenseman. Why are we not keeping him? We're trying to win the Stanley Cup. And the informed fan can discern between that. But the average fan who maybe reads the newspaper or maybe engages with some groups on Facebook or on Twitter, those are not the fans who are going to peel back the numbers and try and analyze a sudden jump in production. So we're going to take a quick break. Then we're going to come back. We're going to talk about where Darnell Nurse's value has previously come from, where it's supposed to come from, and ways the Oilers have tried to maximize his value, coming up next on this episode of Locked On Oilers. So stay tuned. I love sports. I love them so much, I never want them to stop. But now that the playoffs are over in basketball and hockey, we've got fewer games. All we've got is baseball and the WNBA. And the sports are not sportsing like I want them to. But FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. All I have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime I'm in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a booster bonus daily. That's right. something for everyone, every day, all summer long. I personally will be throwing a couple bucks on Pete Alonso to win the home run derby next week. So head on over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. Thank you to everybody who's making Locked On Oilers a part of their Tuesday. Hope everybody is staying cool. It is miserably hot in the Northeast of the United States. It's July. It's not going to be pleasant, but we're making do, and the hockey content will not stop. I promise it will not stop. And part of the reason I wanted to do this episode today was I spent a lot of yesterday's show thinking about creative ways the Oilers could try and improve their roster, how they could come up with more cap space. And the Oilers are kind of in a rough position where both Nurse and Evander Kane have full no movement clauses, at least through next year. In Kane's case, it's March 5th. Darnell Nurse's is not for 2 more seasons. So unless those guys want to leave a team that made it to Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Final, whoever the GM is, whether it's Jeff Jackson or someone else, they're out of luck. They don't have an option of creating, 5.5 in Kane's case or 9.25 in Nurse's case out of thin air, because that would solve a lot of issues if the Oilers were just in a position to make the Nurse contract go away or make the Evander Kane contract go away. And I didn't want to just single out Evander Kane because that didn't feel fair. Well, I have my qualms about Evander Kane as a person, and I think he is overpaid quite a bit. It's not fair to just single out one guy. So circling back around to Nurse, who's the primary focus of this episode, we talked a lot about the context in terms of expectations, where he was drafted, why he got the contract he did. The other component of this is you need to think about what Nurse's perceived strengths are. If you are a hockey guy, if you're a general manager, if you're a director of the professional scouting where you scout other NHL teams, you see a big defenseman who can move okay for his size. That would tell you he is a puck retrieving defenseman who is supposed to protect his own blue line off of the rush. And then, because he's a little bit more mobile than the average defenseman, occasionally contribute offensively. We're not saying anything more than 30 points or so, but in a vacuum, you think based on his skill set, you would be able to manufacture some offense out of him. But the problem is Nurse's traits, like his size, his skating, they don't necessarily correlate to what you would think he's good at. And I'm not prepared to say he's not good at anything. He's in the NHL. He very clearly can use his body on occasion, but with a decline in mobility, he isn't as lively on the puck. He doesn't win foot races as often, and he's more inclined to use his size to try and create plays, which often means taking himself out of position to throw a hit. And when you do that, you're going to leave your defensive partner alone. And when he played most of last season with Cody Ceci is not a defensive stalwart. Ceci, you can get by with as your 5th or 6th defenseman as a puck mover and occasionally contribute offensively. But for the most part, Nurse's expectation was to be the defense first guy. And I'm going to click over to my notes here. The Darnell Nurse value is supposed to come from his defensive ability. 2.29 minutes per game on the penalty kill. He sneaks on to the power play, the second power play unit, a minute or so per game. That was last year. Career 5% shooter. So this is not somebody who's in that Zadorov, Quinn Hughes, Adam Fox tier, who you can get bank on 10 to 15 goals. 17th most block shots of any player in the NHL last year. The most block shots of any Oiler. And the main idea of a guy like Nurse, when you look at his traits, and this is always what the hockey talking heads, the Elliot Friedmans, the Jeff Merricks, the Chris Johnstons, the Pierre LeBruns, they love to hammer this point, and I'm going to say it. You want those guys, you want the big physical defensemen because they can stand up in the playoffs. They can withstand the toll that the playoffs take on you. The problem with that Nomer is those guys are also usually slow and they're not great at moving the puck. So it's great. They can take a lick, they can take some abuse, and they can eat it. But the problem with Nurse and other similar defensemen of his skill set is that in the playoffs, when you are playing teams that are structured well, that forecheck aggressively, they don't mind hitting you over and over and over again if you're going to keep turning the puck over. And that brings me to some data from All Three Zones. All Three Zones is a stat tracking project. Corey Schneider does it. Very useful tool to analyze micro actions within the game, zone exits, puck retrievals, failed retrievals, and it's very straightforward. Nurse has the most failed retrievals of anybody on the Oilers and the second lowest rate of retrievals leading to exits. The only defenseman worse in terms of that, Vinny Desharnais. And then you go over to zone exits versus clears. Nurse clears the puck, which means just looping it out of the zone as opposed to passing it out of the zone at the highest rate of any Oiler. And he exits with possession, the second lowest rate of any Oiler defenseman, in front of only Cody Ceci. Then you look at retrievals to exits with possession. The only defenseman he's better than is Cody Ceci. You look at retrievals and failed exits and then retrievals leading to exits. He has the most botched retrievals and failed exits of any defenseman on the Oilers. And he's a little bit better as far as... And then he has a really poor rate of retrievals that lead to zone exits. So when you look under the hood, Nurse's value is supposed to be retrieving the puck and getting it to his defensive partner. And look, I understand Cody Ceci is not Erik Karlsson. If you get him the puck, he's not exactly going to break it out. And that's supposed to be the composition. Every defensive pair is supposed to be a mover and a retriever. In an ideal world, you have somebody who's good at both. You have an Adam Fox, you have a Quinn Hughes or Charlie McAvoy. But most defensemen, they profile as one or the other. In the case of Darnell Nurse, he is not a mover. He is not passing the puck out of danger. He is not skating the puck out of danger. His utility is supposed to be get the puck, take the check, get it to my partner, and my partner breaks it out. Nurse fails to retrieve the puck, so he can't get it to his partner. Then the Oilers are hemmed in their own zone. Then the other team can get to work on the forecheck and start to wear them down. That's where the frustration with Nurse comes from. It's not that he is useless. It's that he is not good at the function he is supposed to fulfill. Nurse, in terms of actual production and results, profiles as a fifth or a sixth defenseman. The Oilers are paying him to be their best defenseman. The Oilers want him to just win pucks and get it to his partner. He can't even win loose pucks, whether that's a positioning thing, a puck skills thing, or a skating thing. He does not fulfill the utility he is supposed to, and that's why the Oilers defense struggles. I went on a podcast yesterday and talked about the Oilers for a while, and the host had asked me if I thought who was more culpable for their loss in the final, whether it was Stuart Skinner or someone else, and I said it was the defense. If the Oilers have slightly better defensive play, whether it's Nurse, whether it's Ceci, whether it's Kulak, I think the Oilers win that series because all their issues in the 3 games they lost before Game 7 was the inability to clear the zone, was forcing pucks where it didn't need to. And because of that, the Oilers are sitting here wondering, how can we improve on the margins and get better in a hyper-competitive Western Conference? We're going to take one more quick break here on Locked On Oilers, then we're going to come back. We're going to talk about the big picture, managing things going forward, so stick around. Hello, and thank you for listening to this edition of Locked On Oilers. Hopefully, you are not sweating your butt off like I am recording this episode right now. So, Darnell Nurse is pretty much as close to immovable as it gets. Unless he wants to go, he is not going anywhere. I have no reason to believe a former 7th overall pick, who's been in the organization for 11 years, who is under contract for several more years, is going to voluntarily leave a good team to go to the type of team that could afford to or want to acquire him. If you're the Ducks, if you're the Sharks, if you're the Blackhawks, if you're the Blue Jackets, if you're a bad team, I could see a world where you want Darnell Nurse for his experience, his willingness to play physically, and to frankly be a voice around your young guys who need someone to lean on during difficult times. Darnell Nurse been through some difficult times in the NHL. He's been there longer than Draisaitl, longer than McDavid. He has been through the meat grinder, if you will, of the NHL in a difficult market where he bears a lot of the blame, even if it's not always his fault. I know I just spent the last 10 minutes in the last segment kind of riding the guy, giving him a hard time, but it's not always his fault when the Oilers lose. It just so happens that he usually has a contributing role in when they do lose. So the Oilers are trying to salvage this player as best they can. You saw it at points in the playoffs when they bumped him down to 16 minutes a game from 18 minutes a game. You saw it when they broke up the CC Nurse pair. You saw it when they started to play Philip Broberg with Darnell Nurse, and making Broberg, who, does not have a lot of NHL experience, play on his offside to accommodate Darnell Nurse as a puck mover. It's really crazy. And it's really unfortunate that the Oilers need to kind of babysit to facsimile safe production out of an expensive player. When you pay someone $9 million a year in the NHL, you're expecting them to do things on their own, that they are a driving force. And instead, Nurse needs help. He needs a good puck mover with him, or he's close to unplayable. The penalty kill value, yeah, he blocks shots, he can throw hits. That's great. All of that stuff has some utility. But you don't pay a guy $9 million a year to block shots and to throw hits. Darnell Nurse is the 8th highest paid defenseman in the entire NHL, and the Oilers are paying for their mistake. They bought a player having a career year in a walk year and are now trying to just get reasonable, not even good, just trying to get reasonable production out of Nurse. And because of that, they need to find a complementary piece. And in a vacuum, Nurse and CC kind of make sense. CC's a good skater for a defenseman and is supposed to be good at moving the puck. He doesn't have good decision making. He turns the puck over an awful lot, and he's not physical enough to win puck battles. So if Nurse sends him a bad pass and handcuffs him, that puck's going to the other team. But the frustration with Nurse is the Oilers are going to have to babysit him, and that contract is only going to look worse the older he gets. It is easy for me as somebody who is not a general manager to say he was having a career year in a walk year and it wasn't worth it no matter what the Oilers were going to do. No matter what type of contract, it probably wasn't going to go well. But it's easy for me to take a step as someone not in the situation and say, well, you just got to eat it. You got to walk away. You can't afford to give a bad contract where you're at in this situation, because that's just not the reality of how sports actually work. Sports decision makers, general managers, presidents, owners do not always make decisions with just the on-ice impact in mind. Sometimes they do have to make, for the lack of a better word, political decisions of, well, this guy, we drafted him high, he's been in the organization for this long, he's a valuable component of our locker room chemistry, so we're going to roll the dice and hope that this was not an anomaly. And that's very clearly what happened. It was very clear that the Oilers felt they could not walk away from Darnell Nurse because of where they were as an organization positionally. They didn't have any defensemen they felt could ascend to that number one role. Thankfully, they did luck out, and Evan Bouchard has turned out to be a lot better, a lot faster than some people were expecting. And now it's about managing expectations. I think you have a better chance of moving Evander Kane because his contract status changes sooner. He makes less money. And frankly, I think it's an easier argument for not disrupting the chemistry of the team if you were to move him as opposed to Nurse. But that said, you're going to go into next season, and Nurse is probably going to be your 4th or 5th defenseman. I don't see a world where he's going to have the lowest time on ice of any defenseman on the Oilers, because frankly, that last right-handed defenseman spot, whether it's Joshua Brown or Troy Stecher, that's going to be a hold on and pray until the trade deadline situation. And look, I like Troy Stecher, but didn't play a lot last year, coming off a serious leg injury. I don't know how realistic it is to expect him to be a steady 6th defenseman on a team that has Stanley Cup aspirations. I definitely think the Oilers are going to need to improve their defense in season through a trade of some kind. Nurse can't be traded. It's that simple. He does not go to a 10-team no-trade list until 2027, 2028. Unfortunately, he's probably the Oilers' second worst defenseman. This past season, he was the Oilers' worst defenseman in terms of goals above replacement on Evolving Wilds model. Goals above replacement is not perfect. It is not a defining statistic of a player, but it is useful for comparison amongst large groups because it distills out value based on a few categories: offense, defense, ability to draw penalties, not taking penalties, and winning faceoffs if you're a center. But in the case of Nurse, the Oilers are going to do their best to manufacture a decent season. He's going to play less minutes. And one thing I forgot to mention is last season was the least difficult quality of competition Nurse had played against since 2016, 2017, when he was the fifth most common defenseman on the team. The Oilers know they can't match him up against elite competition and are doing their best to protect him. It's difficult because he's probably going to play a lot with the third and fourth lines. Those lines are not going to drive possession as well. It's going to put more responsibility on him and whoever his partner is, whether it's Broberg, whether it's someone else, to move the puck and get it out, because those forwards are not going to be able to break out as cleanly. They are not going to be able to skate the puck out of danger as quickly as some of the other candidates the Oilers have had in years past. That was something Ryan McLeod in particular was very good at. And for the Oilers, managing expectations for Nurse is frustrating because you're paying him a lot, but salvaging the value is the only recourse. You can revisit this conversation in 2 years, whether there's a different salary cap situation where if there's a lot of money in the market, if the salary cap's $105 million 2-3 years from now, okay, then maybe I can see a world where you can just outright buy him out and make the contract go away. But you're probably looking at least 2 more seasons, if not 3, of Darnell Nurse on the Oilers, and to taper your expectations for his performance. I am not saying he is irrevocably broken as a hockey player, but I am saying it's probably going to be difficult for him to ever live up to that contract. So with all that said, that will do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers, the Darnell Nurse Show. Hope everybody enjoyed today's show. If you could be so kind, please take a moment, subscribe to the show on whatever podcast platform you're listening to. If you are on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please take an extra second, leave the show a 5-star review. If you are watching over on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, hit the alarm bell, get a notification whenever new content goes live, and leave me a comment. Did you think the Darnell Nurse contract was going to age as poorly as it did right away when it signed? Or did you kind of have buyer's remorse about a year or two into it? So I will talk to you guys tomorrow. Until then, let's go Oilers.